Well, this week, the Kansas Legislature is back in session after a break. And the biggest challenge our state's lawmakers face is balancing the budget for next year. Current projections of revenue and spending show that there is not enough revenue to support the level of spending that the legislature has decided on in its budget. Now, depending on how you look at things, the state has either a revenue problem or a spending problem. Liberals and progressives uniformly say we have a revenue problem. They cite the income tax cuts of a few years ago, and their solution is to restore the old higher tax rates and therefore bring more money to the state. Conservatives have generally said the state has a spending problem, and the way to balance the budget is to cut spending. But this is changing now. Many conservatives are embracing more revenue, that is, higher taxes. Here's an example from Wichita Eagle reporting. The newspaper said, Representative Steve Brunk, a Wichita Republican, has been a staunch opponent of tax increases. Last year, he told Americans for Prosperity in a candidate survey that he would not raise taxes, and he also has signed the Norquist Pledge. It's a different world today, Brunk said of the survey he filled out before the state's revenue problems set in. Brunk said he's still wrestling with the idea of raising taxes given the massive budget hole the state faces. He still wants to see more budget cuts, but he's not sure whether that's enough to fill the deficit. There's my personal ideology on this issue, Brunk said. Then there's the uncomfortable reality of where we are. And end quote from the Wichita Eagle. Now, many other conservatives in Kansas are sending the same messages as Representative Brunk, who represents a section of northeast Wichita, including my home. This is distressing to hear lawmakers toss aside ideology, because an ideology is something that you really believe in. The dictionary says that an ideology is a set of doctrines or beliefs that are shared by the members of a social group or that form the basis of a political, economic, or other system. It's not something you toss aside when the going gets tough, when circumstances change. It's something that you really believe, a foundational belief. Now, liberals are not discarding their ideological belief that there should be more taxation and spending. So why are conservatives abandoning their beliefs? I understand that it is difficult for politicians to cut spending. Cutting taxes is easy by comparison. But the Kansas Legislature has had time to prepare for this day, and despite being in the hands of conservative leadership, the legislature did not take the steps to reform state spending to match the tax cuts that were passed. The legislature, quite simply, finds itself in a difficult situation of its own making. The budget bill under consideration in the Kansas legislature this year calls for spending $3 million for the production of an efficiency analysis review. This is a good idea, but it is too late to help the legislature balance the budget this year and next. Trimming Kansas government spending is a long-term project. A few years ago, the legislature looked at several bills that would help control spending, but the bills failed to become law. Had they been passed when introduced, the state would be in a much better position to make the needed reforms. But a look at the history of these bills leads us to wonder if the leaders of our state government, both in the executive and legislative branches, are really serious about controlling spending. The three bills concerned creating a streamlining commission, a privatization initiative, and creating performance measures. They were in play during the 2011 and 2012 legislative sessions. They all passed the House of Representatives in 2011, but given that the Senate was in the hands of moderate Republicans, there was little chance that the bills would also pass the Senate. And that's what happened. Each bill died in the Senate. Moderate Republicans and their Democratic allies were not in favor of reforming Kansas state government spending. But starting with the 2013 session, the Senate has been in conservative hands. So, have these bills been reintroduced? Well, with the exception of the efficiency analysis review I mentioned and a look at K through 12 education, I don't believe these bills or anything else like them have been introduced or considered. Both chambers of the Kansas Legislature and the governor's mansion have been under the control of conservatives for 3 years, but no serious initiative to control spending has emerged, with the exception of the Efficiency Task Force on K-12 education. This ought to cause voters to ask if the desire and will to cut spending truly exists. And I find it curious that liberals and progressives in Kansas are opposed to efforts to increase government efficiency. They all blasted the school task force. If the government services that liberals support are truly vital, well, they ought to insist that they are delivered as efficiently as possible so that the greatest number may benefit to the greatest extent. But that doesn't happen. But there is a path forward. Recently, I attended a meeting where a speaker reported his observations of state workers wasting time while at work. They were playing computer games. He contrasted that to the private sector, where he said this waste is less likely to happen. He asked, shouldn't we investigate state agencies looking for instances of waste and when found, eliminate the waste? Well, that's a good idea, but it's something that I think would be difficult to accomplish. There is an easier way to root out inefficiencies in the operations of state government and local and federal government too, for that matter. And that is to use the benefits for the private sector that the speaker praised. We can do this by outsourcing government functions to the private sector. Then the work is done under the motivations that exist in the private sector. Kansas Policy Institute produced a report in 2013 that shows how Kansas can save money using the principles of privatization and outsourcing. The report is titled Better Service, Better Price: How Privatization Can Streamline Government, Improve Services, and Reduce Costs for Kansas Taxpayers. You can read it at kansaspolicy.org or wichitaliberty.org. Reforms of this nature take some time to implement. Several years ago, Kansas governmental leaders had time to start the state on a path to reform, but they did not do that. Now these same leaders are considering raising taxes to balance the Kansas budget. This did not have to happen. There's a lot of blame to spread around, which probably means that no one will be held accountable.